Well, the big non-news today, brought to you by Nationalist News and Notes. This is Corncod 1. The big news today is that 300 newspapers in the United States have all coordinated to print a single article. I think some of them may be printing their own editorials, trying to, as usual, distort the news, saying that Donald Trump is against the freedom of the press because Donald Trump tells the establishment media that they're a bunch of liars and scum. Well, whatever they may think of it, Donald Trump has never called for the elimination of freedom of the press. In the campaign, once or twice, he said about perhaps making the laws of libel and slander a little tougher, but he hasn't really followed up on that. But Donald Trump has never called for the elimination of freedom of the press. But these idiots are acting or pretending, let us say, that Donald Trump has called for the elimination of freedom of the press. Freedom of the press doesn't necessarily mean that the press is free from criticism. The establishment media in the United States is using their rights under the First Amendment freedom of the press to criticize the president. The president is using his First Amendment freedom of speech to criticize them back. There's no violation of the Constitution here. There's nothing to see. And so we have to sit and sort of perhaps speculate as to why the establishment leftist media have their panties all in a twist. I think what it is they're a bunch of liberal snowflakes and they don't like to be criticized. Number one. Number two, the establishment media, thanks to alternative forms of media, like this one, for example, are becoming less and less influential. And nobody really respects them anymore. And that second one, I think, is very important. The leftist media, when they got together, and they always get together, they're like some weird cult where they all think alike, they all use the same phrases about things. I mean, some of that may come from the wire services, but by and large, leftism is is a weird quasi-religious cult, and they all say things in exactly the same way. They react to things in exactly the same way, and it's a little scary, right? They'll use the exact same phraseology in a left-wing newspaper in Maine, and they'll use the exact same phraseology in a left-wing newspaper in California. They're a bunch of really unimaginative creeps. And they're boring. They're so boring. None of them have much in the way of interesting ideas or interesting observations. There may be one or two out there, but I think it may have a lot to do with the fact that the elite universities are no longer producing interesting leftists anymore. They're producing dull, bland, politically correct idiot leftists. Whereas, perhaps in an older generation, there were some more interesting leftists, but not so much anymore. And so the American people, a huge proportion of the American people, tire of them. They don't like them. And, maybe they hop on the computer and take a look at Alex Jones. Or, if they're really desperate, Corncod 1. But it's just the left being a bunch of babies once again. The left-wing media used to have they still have a lot of power in this country, but they used to have the power to instantly destroy. I mean, look what they did to Nixon. Mr. Obama got away with a lot more illegal nonsense than Mr. Nixon ever did. But they got their revenge on Nixon because he didn't go to an elite college and he sent Alger Hiss to prison. A member of the club. So they went after him for that and they destroyed him. And not that I'm a big Nixon partisan, but they used to have extreme power. They used to have the power to destroy anyone at will. This weird cult. And hey, this weird cult is using its First Amendment rights. Just as any weird cult like Mormonism can use their rights in the publishing of their publications. And we have the right to call them idiots. I'm sure the average American with average intelligence, sits watching CNN and sees Jim Acosta making a fool of himself at presidential press conferences, trying to put words in the mouth of Miss Huckabee and getting progressively hysterical as he does so. And Fred says to Mabel, gee, it looks like Mr. Acosta's making a fool of himself today. So they don't have the power they used to, and so they're getting more and more hysterical. So it really has nothing to do with some sort of presidential plan to take away freedom of speech, and freedom of the press. There is no presidential plan to take away freedom of the press. He's never said anything like that. But they sort of like to pretend that it's the case. It makes them feel good, as if they're standing up for something. Hey, maybe you should write interesting editorials again. Maybe you should think a little bit. It's amazing how in lockstep the left is in the United States. All the fun is on the right. Even when we attack each other. There's very little internal warfare within the left in the United States. You'll never hear me criticize Ben. You'll hear me criticize Ben Shapiro. I think he's a jerk and an ethnic cheerleader, an ethno-religious cheerleader, and a bum. You'll never hear a liberal do that because they're all in lockstep. They're like a weird cult, and they're boring, and they're no fun, and they're so censorious. They're like a bunch of little old church ladies. They're more censorious than little old church ladies ever were. So let's laugh at their, the very fact that they're all coordinating in this one editorial shows that it all seems they're coordinated. Where do they, they tend to get their marching orders from the New York Times, and it spreads to the Washington Post and the LA Times, and they all end up saying the same thing. And then the cable news media chimes in. And when it's all over, they're all saying the same thing. What was it? G.K. Chesterton, probably nearly 100 years ago, basically said that journalists were lazy, and a lot of them are. And frankly, I think the latest crop of journalists in the United States are not only lazy, I think they're ill-educated. And I'm not saying that from an ideological standpoint. I'm saying, I've always said, going back to when I was a student, the dull professors at college were usually the ones that didn't know their stuff, that didn't really have a command of their subject. And so that's why they were dull. And so the current leftist mainstream media in the United States, they're dull because most of them don't know what they're talking about. Well, I'll not become dull by ending my statement. This is Corncod 1 of Nationalist News and Notes, signing off.